For the last few weeks, we've looked at some Psalms and we've looked at some titles. And the titles have gone through some of who God is. We just sang a song about Him being our Redeemer and our healer and our deliverer. And so a few weeks ago, we did He is Sovereign. And we also talked about He being our, not a refuge, but our deliverer, our defender. And then He is King. He is our King. And today we're going to look at God being eternal. He is eternal. And Psalm 90 explains, kind of comes from another perspective. We had looked at a perspective from David and from Solomon. And now this is a psalm that Moses wrote. At the beginning of Psalm 90, you see that it says, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Now, Moses was a pastor of 2 million people, and he had to go to God and talk to God constantly because that was a lot of people to oversee and shepherd. And he wrote Psalm 90, and there's a few places that we could figure out where and when he wrote this, which is important. One is before the wilderness wandering. Remember, they had wandered for 40 years because of the Israelites' disobedience. And so they're wandering in the wilderness. And so before this, in Numbers 13, Moses sent out 12 men out to spy out the new land. And 10 came back and said, don't go. If we go, we will be dead meat. But Caleb, one of the two, said, God is big, let's go and let's do it. Let's take it. But what happened was the majority of the people believed the media and believed the majority, and they let themselves become afraid rather than have faith. And then they wandered around the desert for the next almost 40 years. So that's one possibility of Psalm 90. The other one is possibly in Numbers 20, 38 years after the first event. Moses is now old, and 3 very important things happened in that chapter. Number 1, Moses had lost his sister, Miriam. She had passed away. Number 2, Moses had lost his brother Aaron, and he had passed away. Number 3, probably the greater significant thing that happened to Moses that could have discouraged him and disappointed him, was he disobeyed God because God had told him to speak to a rock and tell water to come out of the rock. And instead of doing what God told him to do, he, in his anger, struck the rock and disobeyed God, and because of that, he was not able to go to the promised land that he desired to be in and to walk into. But no matter where you place this writing, this prayer that Moses prayed, both of those times are of great loss for Moses. And with that background, we uncover some truths in this Psalm 90. And I've got 5 of them on your bulletin today. There are 5 truths that have some application that you can apply to your life. And these are significant. Moses is looking back through loss and through pain, and he prays. And so these truths that we're going to look at could, and I don't say they will because it depends on what you want to do with them, but they could change your life, transform your life in the next year. In fact, they could change your life tomorrow or today. And so let's look at 5 truths. Number 1, God is big. Magnify Him. God is big. Magnify Him. Verse 1, Moses says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. You are a great God. And so the main subject of this prayer is not Moses, and it's not the circumstances around Moses' life, but this psalm is about who Moses' God is. That Moses had this great view of his God, and he saw miraculous things that God did, and he saw devastating things that God did, and he still believed and trusted God. He was looking back through his generations, his parents' generation, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, and he goes all the way back to the very beginning of creation, Adam and Eve, and he says, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. Now, a shelter is another way to say that is, you've been our fortress. You have been our home, our house. One translator says, you have been our den. Now, a den, some of us don't know that because maybe that's a word used in maybe in the old days, but also maybe in the Midwest. A den would be like a family room. And some homes maybe still do, have formal living rooms, and then they have dens, family rooms. And if you're invited into a house, you're only put into the formal living room if you are like a salesman, or if you don't want the people to stay very long, you put them in the formal living room. It's a little cold and it's formal. But if you get invited into the family room, the den, that's a good sign. That means that you have a relationship that's deeper and you are being welcomed and there's a close friendship. So he says, Lord, you have been our den for all generations. He was thinking back as the children of Israel, wandering for years, pitching tents and not having a home, and they had been looking for that promised land. And he says, Lord, you have been close to us. You have been our den. So the question is today, one of the questions is, are you at home with God? Are you at ease with God? Are you hanging out with God? Think about it this way. If God is your dwelling place now, you will be with him in his eternal dwelling place later. If you have connected with him and if you are dwelling with him now. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Moses had a great view of God. God is huge to him, and he is close. And in this Psalms, he makes much of God. He paints God as magnificent and great and big and eternal. And God speaks, and it's done. God commands, and it happens. Moses magnifies God. He writes about it. Even if Moses didn't say anything about God's magnificence and greatness, he would still be magnificent and great. And even if we don't say it, God is still magnificent and great. But how do you make great the greatest one who ever lived? How do you make God greater than he already is? Well, there are stars in the galaxy that you and I have never seen with our eye, but they exist. And there are some stars that are huge. In fact, there's one I found called Regulus, which you may have heard of or not, but it's a blue-white star that is approximately 4 times wider than the sun and it is 140 times as bright, and it is about 80 light years from Earth. It's 100th closest star system. It is the 21st brightest object in the night sky. But we don't think about those stars on a regular basis. We don't see them unless somebody magnifies them, like the Hubble telescope. If someone brings a telescope and it takes what's going on far away, and it brings it closer to us so that we can see it and we say, wow. Right? It's magnified. By what you say and how you act, you can make God big or small. So the point is magnify him. This is also true when we face crises. People actually eavesdrop when we have crises in our lives. They get a little closer, they put their ear to the situation, and they listen to what's going on with someone who loves God and someone who trusts God, and how are they going to act in this situation. So when you're in crisis, you either can magnify God, showing him that he is strong and that he is watching out for those that he loves, or you can drive people further away from him and make God small. So God is big, magnify him. Number 2, which is the hard one to swallow, and that is, you are frail, rest in him. You are frail, rest in him. Verses 3-8 say this in Psalms 90. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by the evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. You'll notice that in between 3 and 8, there's a comparison between God and man, God and humans. God is great, he is infinite, and we are finite. God is big and man is small. God is unlimited, we are limited. God is timeless and ageless. He doesn't look at his watch. He doesn't look at his phone to tell what time it is. And yet we are limited by time and space and age. In other words, we are frail. And one of the biggest differences between God and us is this little word called control. I don't know if you've ever met a control freak in your life, but it's a person who always wants to be in control of a situation. There may be a few out there in this world, and they are not easy to hang out with. Excuse me. Here's the problem with people who want to control their lives too much. There's so much of life that we cannot control. There's so much of life that we cannot control. And there's so little of life that we do control. We just try and we make our plans. We try and make ourselves better by making all these plans and hoping that it's going to happen the way we've set it up. But there is so much out of control. I don't know if you've ever prayed for somebody and hoped that they would be healed, and yet they get sicker or possibly pass away. Or, we can't control that. Or have you ever given advice to people and you think it's good and biblical advice, right? And if they would just apply it, that things would get better for them. But they don't see it as important enough to apply to their life, and maybe they don't agree. But we can't control their decisions. Sometimes I wish I could, but I can't. I can't even control the schedule half the time. But, because life happens. So much, a general age of 70 to 80 years old, possibly like we do. Verse 11, if only we knew the power of your anger, for a motto for you in the next year. Blessed are the flexible, they will not be broken. So be like Gumby, right? Flexible. We want to gain power. We want to have control. We want to make bad things better. We would love to set order into this world and make justice work, but it seems like it's out of control. But the truth is that God, we've talked about this a few weeks ago, God is sovereign and we are not. God is in control and we are frail. He is in total control. Verse 5, we are like grass that grows up. In the morning it flourishes and it grows up, and it grows up because of the dew of the water in the ground. But in the evening, it's cut down and it withers. The sun scorches it. Moses' point in this is, just as the grass withers, you wither. The older you get, the more you wither. Time accelerates, or at least it seems like it, when you get older. I saw my grandson Eli, I have a picture, on Friday. I saw him, if you want. Oh, it's so cute. So, our first grandson, I got to babysit him. He is 9 months old. He's standing, he's crawling, he's making noises. And you know what? Time flies. It just increases. And the next thing you know, he's going to be 13, right? Well, I hope there's some time in between that. In fact, it's almost 2021. Incredible, isn't it? So here's the deal. It just makes sense. If there's so little that you and I can control in life, why not rest in the arms of the one who does control everything? Right? Because we have such little control over life. Moses talks about magnifying God. He talks about resting in him. So that's number 2. You are frail, rest in him. Number 3, life is short. Live for him. Life is short. In verse 9, all our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan, a sigh. Our days may, verse 10, our days may come to 70 years or 80 if your strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. For they quickly pass, and we fly away. He gives us a generality of 70 or 80 years. Obviously, Moses lived 120, and maybe that's a generality of that time, 70 or 80 years. We know that can be an average today, and people live more. Verse 11 is as great as the fear that is your due. Verse 12, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So the average year span is 70 or 80. You and I know some people who are in their 90s or maybe even 100. But notice it says, if our strength endures. This may be based on genetics, on environment, cholesterol, exercise, and if you could postpone 70 and make it 80 or 90, you're just postponing the inevitable. We all face the consequence of sin in this universe, and that is death. Interesting, in Psalm 90, Moses tells us that we ought to view our life by our days, not our years. And if someone asked you how old you are, would you start counting your days? You tell them, not your minutes or hours or days or whatever, but you tell them how old you are in years. When you're young, you add the half years, right? 10 and a half sounds better than 10. You're trying to gain as much as you can. But when you're 50 or almost 50, you say proudly 49, even if you're 2 days away from 50. And so Moses said we ought to look at our life by days. And so I Googled it. And I discovered that I have lived today 17,840 days. That sounds like a lot, and it's a little depressing, but it adds perspective to our life. Here's another way to look at your life. If you're 59 years old today, and let's say you have another year or so to live, you have in reality only 365 days left to live. And if you strip away all the time you spend eating and sleeping and working and going to the doctor and going to the dentist and being in traffic and all the miscellaneous things, that's not much time. You have the ability to decide. That's the control part you do have. How are you going to spend your days for the next 365 days? The point is simple. Life is short. Life is fragile. So teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Another way to put it is time flies. It's up to you to be the navigator. But counting time is not as important as making time count. That's the thrust of it. Make your time count. Life is short. Live for Him. How can you do that practically? I'll give you three ABC, the ABCs. No, A stands for acknowledge. Acknowledge that there is no guarantees of how long you will live. You have no guarantee. So acknowledge that. It does say in the text, if by reason of strength you live to be 80. That's a big if. So acknowledge that there are no guarantees. You might live another 20 years. You might live another 2. The Bible says it's appointed unto every man once to die. So God has appointed, so God has made an appointment with you concerning death. The problem is, He hasn't told you when the appointment is that you will keep. So there's no guarantee. Have you made plans for the next new year? Have you made plans for the next month? This last month brought many surprises to all of us. We didn't know last December what would happen in January or April or June or October. It's good to plan things, but just realize something. God has editing rights over your script. You may have written the script or thought you had. You know what you want. You may have it all planned out. Great. work toward that goal. But God has editing rights. So first, acknowledge there's no guarantees how long you will live. B stands for breathe. Breathe more this next year. Take life in smaller chunks. Don't worry about your whole life. Worry about one day at a time. At the end of the day, ask yourself, how did I do today? That is numbering your days. Also, under breath, I would say with the same letter, breaks. Take more breaks in your routine. Take time to change it up. Drive a different way to work. Stop and take a picture of scenery. Take a break in the middle of your work routine. And if your boss is okay with it, go for a walk and pray. Get your mind focused on completely different subject or activity. It will actually help your productivity in the long run. Take more breaks. And also underneath breathe, I would say pray before taking new responsibilities. Some people are just prone to say yes to everything without evaluating to see if that is what God has called you to do. And so acknowledge. A, acknowledge. B, breathe. C, commit every day to the Lord. Tell him every day, Lord, I want you to take control. Lord, help me to rest in you and not in me. How would you live today if you thought that it was your last? Jesus told the parable of the rich man, the parable of the rich fool who had so much. He said, I'm going to build bigger barns to store my stuff in it. And God said, you fool, this night your soul will be required of you. So the ABCs, make your time count. Getting back to the overall 5 points. God is big. Magnify him. You are frail. Rest in him. Life is short. Live for him. And then number 4, joy is possible. Depend on him. Look, when you look at 13 through 15, Moses prays for joy. In the midst of his pain, in the midst of his struggle, in the midst of his loss, he says, relent, Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. Moses is praying for joy in comparison to the sorrows that they have tasted out in the wilderness. Can you imagine what it would be like if you were living 40 years in the desert in tents, burying people on a regular basis? An entire generation died out there in the wilderness. So in the midst of all that death and all that loss, Moses prays for joy. And how on earth can you have joy when all those things are happening around you? There's only one way: by depending on him for it, by asking him for it. Lord, help me to rejoice. Paul wrote in Philippians 4, rejoice in the Lord always, and I say it again, rejoice. We also play a part in that joy. It's part of our choice. It's the choice of what kind of outlook we're going to have. Is your outlook going to be determined based on the fact that you know God is great and you know that you are frail, and that which will lead you to resting in Him. Press into Him. Lean into Him. Because if you do, you will have joy. Joy comes with the life of trust. And so Paul writes, rejoice in the Lord. You know, he wrote that from a Roman jail cell. He talked about how much joy he had in the midst of that. You know, my wife and I have been to Paris, France, and we had the opportunity to go look at some beautiful paintings in the Louvre and Versailles. We saw some really beautiful gardens. But in the Louvre, there's paintings up in the ceiling, all different paintings. But my guess is similar to Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. He spent a lot of time on one of those walls, a big mural called The Last Judgment. And he had on the scaffolding, he had been on the scaffolding for 2 weeks straight in almost the same position. His neck was bent back, and he was working on his delicate piece of painting. And when he came down off the scaffolding, because he had been so used to looking up for so long, he found it painful to look down to the ground. There are some people that live in the reverse of that. They are so used to looking down at all the bad stuff in life, it's actually painful for them to look up and expect God to give them joy. Why not make the choice this next year? Maybe even today. Joy is possible. Depend on Him. Ask Him for it. Number 5, the last one, is there is a plan. Work for Him. Verse 16, he continues his prayer. Moses continues to pray, and then he closes it. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to your children. There is a connection between verse 16 and verse 17. Notice in verse 16, Moses, he prays to the Lord and writes, your deeds, your work. And in the verse 17, he says, the work of our hands. This is the secret to making sure that your life is not a waste, by investing your life into His work. By making sure your work and His work are the same work. God will bless the work of your hands when the work of your hands is His work. It doesn't matter what job you have, you can still do God's work in that place. It has been said there are 2 significant days in your life. Number 1, it's the day that you were born. And number 2, it's the day you discovered what you were born for. And when you discover that, this is why I'm here. I'm going to get involved in God's work while I'm on this earth. Yesterday, we had an opportunity to go down to the Nazarene Church and build platforms. And there were probably 40 people down there helping build platforms for the homeless, the less fortunate to sleep on, because they can't go inside this year because of COVID, and so sleeping outside in tents on platforms will be better. And we had the opportunity to work an hour and a half of our life, but it was the most rewarding kingdom work that anybody could do. When we make His work our work, then we are following the plan. There's a Roman city named Segovia. One of the landmarks is an old Roman aqueduct that runs through part of that town. It was built in 109 AD. For 1,800 years, it brought cold water from the mountains to thirsty mouths to the city. 60 generations drank water from this aqueduct until a generation came that said, "This thing is old and so monumental that we ought to not run water through it any more. We ought to build a new system and preserve this sort of as a museum piece for our children and grandchildren." So they piped the water in through modern pipes, and the aqueduct dried up. The sun beating on the mortar just over time disintegrated, and it started flaking off. The stones began to sag because of it. In other words, what years of service couldn't destroy, idleness disintegrated it. So however old you are or get, make sure that you are always in God's service, that you're not idle, that His life is flowing through you to other people. As Jim Corley would say, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. There is a plan. Work for Him. To sum it up, we find human beings are in a strange mixture between dust and divinity. We are all going to die, but we will live forever. We are all creatures of time. At the same time, we are creatures of eternity. And what we do here matters for eternity. There are people who live their life with meaningless existence without eternal purpose. That's why so many people are struggling through this pandemic, and amongst other crises this year, is because people don't have any hope of any other life but this one. And if this life sucks, then what is left? Put their trust in God. What they need more than anything else is to have an encounter with the living God through Jesus Christ, so that they can say, like Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Make sure that you don't just waste your time or spend your time, but invest your time into something that will outlive you. God is eternal. Live for Him. Work for Him. Serve Him. Magnify Him. Rest in Him. Love Him. Let me pray.